Hello, Brubs. We're back with the Memoirs of Bridget Hitler, edited by Michael Unger, illustrated and published by Duckworth, 1979. I believe we're on section 5. It's not exactly a chapter, but we'll do what we can with it. 5. One day we received a letter from Eloise, which, innocent enough in itself, had remarkable consequences. I quote from it as follows. By reading the English papers, I have seen what a lot of nonsense these papers serve to the public, and it can only be for the good if this nonsense gets corrected by an authentic statement. A paper wrote, for instance, he fought in Cuba against the Spaniards, and he fought against England and South Africa, etc. What a nonsense. At the time of the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, Adolf Hitler, born 20th, 420, 24, 1889, was 12 years of age. I therefore give you the following instructions. The brief story of Adolf Hitler, which I sent you last year, contains all important dates and actions of Adolf, and I authorize you to utilize the copyright of this entire pamphlet, but don't give it away for nothing. Any further inquiries you can direct to me by giving them my card, which I enclose. Eloise was right. At that time, the English press, and also the American, I presume, was full of fantastically garbled stories about Hitler, since Adolf Hitler had previously been a nobody and could not be looked up in Who's Who. There was no source of precise information available to reporters. Consequently, they simply made up stories or repeated gossip they had heard. We decided to present our account of his real-life story to two journalists we knew, Mr. Bliss, again with Bliss, of the Evening Standard, and Mr. Frank Long of the Evening News. The resulting article was correct in every detail. After its publication, we forgot about it and went on working as usual. A telegram arrived. We had no reason to connect it in any way with the article which had appeared in the Evening Standard and Evening News. The telegram was as follows. Father dying. Stop. Come Berlin at once. Stop. Aunt Angela. The wire had arrived in the morning. There was no question as to whether Pat should go or not. He left for Berlin that night. The following day I expected a message from him, but none came. I told myself it was because his father was dying and Pat couldn't leave his bedside, though it was unlike Pat not to keep in touch with me. 6 days later, Pat came back from Berlin. Contrary to custom, he didn't notify me beforehand of his arrival. My first glimpse of him was anything but reassuring. His face was pale and drawn, and there were dark circles under his eyes. My father wanted to see me, he explained. That's why he sent the message. He took me to see Uncle Adolf. His voice petered out, and he looked at the ceiling, his expression troubled. I knew Pat wasn't telling everything. It's difficult to deceive a mother, especially when her son has been as close to her as mine had always been. I knew he was trying to spare me by keeping back something that was worrying him. Why don't you tell me, Pat? Maybe you'll feel better, I urged him. You know you can tell me anything. What happened? You're right, Mother. I do want to tell you everything, though it's not easy. It was a great disillusionment. Disillusionment. The first shock was when I got off the train in Berlin. Father was standing on the platform when I had thought he was dying. I was so surprised I couldn't speak. And you know, Mother, I would have liked to turn round right then. How could he let Aunt Angela send me a telegram that he was dying when there was nothing the matter with him? All the way from London to Berlin, I'd been praying that I would get there in time to find him alive, and there he was, as healthy as I am. There wasn't anything wrong with him at all. You must forgive me, Willie, he immediately began to explain. Adolf insisted on my sending you the wire. He wants to see you. He looked at me, and I could see he was wondering how much he ought to tell me. Then he said, Adolf is furious, and I hope to God that you and I get out of this without becoming a head shorter. Pat couldn't believe his father meant what he said seriously. His uncle was an important man, he knew, but that didn't give him life and death power over his relatives. An automobile was waiting for them. Angela was in it. What has happened? Pat asked as soon as they were in the car. But Angela and Eloise made it clear that they couldn't talk in front of the driver. Pat didn't get a word out of them. They pulled up at the Hotel Kurfürstenhof, a second-class hotel on the Linkstrasse. Pat said it looked more like the headquarters of an army than an hotel. He was astonished at the spectacle before him. Uniformed soldiers were rushing about, saluting snappily. Perfect discipline obtained. Pat remembered what his father had told him about Adolf's soldiers. Yet, decidedly, a man who could maintain a private army might very easily be in a position to shorten a few necks. And there's Eloise, Adolf, and Angela, the three principal characters in William Patrick's dramatic meeting in Berlin. I believe that's Hitler's sister, and that's his half-brother. They went upstairs and waited outside Adolf's door. More and more people came in and went out, and there was always telephones ringing. Pat thought their turn would never come. Finally, a young man came out with a basket full of letters and spoke to Eloise, who introduced him to Pat. It was Adolf's private secretary, Mr. Rudolf Hess. He immediately greeted Pat in English and said they could go in. Adolf, dressed in a business suit, was standing at the middle of one of three enormous windows, looking down onto the street, not letting on that he had even noticed their entrance. It was a big corner room, furnished only with a large desk and a few chairs. Angela sat down. Eloise and Pat remained standing. Adolf turned round and glared at the three of them, and then began to walk nervously up and down the room. This must have gone on for several minutes before he pulled up sharply and shouted, "To me, exactly to me, this has to happen." But instead of explaining, he started off again, raging up and down, mumbling to himself, to the blank walls, to the air, to anything except his relatives. I am surrounded by idiots. Yes, you are idiots. You're tearing down everything I have built up with my own two hands. Adolf's hair was tumbling over his forehead, but this time he didn't bother to fling it back. His arms flailed the air in wild violence. He turned to Eloise. "You criminal! You succeeded in smashing everything." "But Adolf," Angela tried to reason with him, but he didn't pay any attention. "What did you tell the newspapers?" he rasped at Pat. "Who gave you permission to appoint yourself an authority on my private affairs?" This was so unexpected Pat didn't know what to say, but Eloise immediately tried to defend him by saying he knew nothing they hadn't told him. "Then tell him now," Adolf roared, turning his back on Pat. Eloise explained that 2 days before the New York office of the Hearst papers had called up the Braun House in Munich and demanded to speak to Adolf Hitler personally. You stop that, you dullard. They wanted to know if he had a nephew in London who was an authority on the Hitler family. Adolf furiously interrupted. They put personal questions to me. To me. Pat still couldn't grasp why Adolf was so angry. After all, Eloise had asked us to correct the false impression created by the English journalists. Pat thought he was doing Adolf a favor. Why didn't Eloise explain? But Adolf had only begun. "My personal affairs are being discussed. Anyone can say who I am, where I was born, what my family does for a living. They mustn't learn about this stupid bigamy. I can't have it. No one must drag my private affairs into the newspapers. I never had said one word they can use, and now this happens. I don't understand anything, Pat said to his father. I didn't tell anything except the truth. The truth, yelled Adolf, nearly beside himself. The truth. I'm being attacked from every side. I have to stand before them without the slightest stain, the slightest blemish, the slightest blemish. The shadow of a suspicion would be enough to ruin me. His voice faltered. Can't you understand that? Or are you too stupid? I am surrounded by fools. My own family is destroying me. His voice trailed off almost into nothing as he allowed himself to sink into a chair, his hands lifting to hide his face. I have been so careful. I am only a step from attaining the top. I might even become chancellor, and now there is a nephew to tell them all the miserable little details they want to know. They'll hound me. At this moment, the door opened to admit an SA officer carrying a briefcase. Adolf looked round and thundered at him with a violence Pat wouldn't have believed possible. How dare you come in here? I left orders not to be disturbed. Get out! Out! The astonished intruder gone, Adolf again dropped into the chair. Grasping the edge of the desk, he began to sob. His eyes brimmed with tears, and he cried out, choking, Idiots! Idiots! You will destroy everything. You will ruin me, you. As though tortured beyond human capacity to endure, he rose painfully and gasped hoarsely, I'll kill myself. I'll put a gun to my head. And he lurched out of the room through another doorway. Stunned by what had happened, bewildered by the situation, Pat turned to Angela. But what harm did I do by telling the truth? What was the title of the article? She asked. My Uncle Adolf. It's not true, Angela cut in, looking sharply at Eloise. Even if your father said so in his letters, you'd better understand once and for all that it's not true. Your father isn't related to Adolf, so naturally you aren't either. Your father had a different father and a different mother. He just lived in our family as an adopted child. By rights, he is no Hitler at all and has no justification for using the name. Is that true, Father? Pat asked Eloise. Yes, that is so. A few minutes later, Adolf returned. He was in complete control of himself and came directly to Pat. I know none of this is your fault, but you must help me put things to rights. Angela took advantage of his new mood to plead. You are right, Adolf. After all, the boy is innocent. He didn't understand he was doing anything wrong when he told the newspaper reporters he was related to you. Now that he sees things clearly, I am sure he will be willing to return and put things right by telling the newspapers he was misinformed and that he was mistaken in claiming relationship with you. Yes, agreed Adolf, that's the only way to proceed. He offered Pat his hand and spoke in a very sincere, serious tone. Will you go back to London and make amends for this, even though it wasn't really your fault but your father's? He should have told you the truth long ago. Adolf sat down on the top of his desk, and they all looked at Pat. When you get back to England, I presume the reporters will get in touch with you. All you have to do is tell them you made a mistake. A mistake? Pat asked. Of course. You were mistaken when you thought you were my nephew. You misunderstood your father, or perhaps it would be best to tell the truth, that he lied to you. His sudden contemptuous glance flicked Eloise, who had seemed on the verge of protesting. Yes, better tell them that your father lied to you. Now he has admitted to you that we aren't related at all. The reporters will let you alone if you tell them that. I'll be in a rotten jam, Pat said to him. They'll think I am a fake. I know I am asking a great deal, but I'm sure you want to do the right thing. I should consider it a great favor. Pat had concluded his account and sat staring in front of him. I wondered if it was true that there was no blood kinship between my husband and Adolf. It seemed impossible to me. While I had been living with my husband, I had ample opportunity to learn the mystery of the Hitler family. its origins and complexities, and now I vividly recalled the bitter words my husband had uttered at the time Adolf was our guest in Liverpool. If there was no blood kinship between them, my husband would surely have mentioned it then, and would have thrown it up at his brother on every occasion, and there had been plenty of occasions when he would have found sufficient provocation. It was clear to me that they had staged a comedy to deceive my son. They had intimidated my husband so that he too had to take part in their scheme, which had undoubtedly originated in Adolf's brain. Eventually, it had become irksome to Adolf that there was an English boy who could call himself his nephew and an Irish woman who was his sister in law. If Adolf should deny it himself, no one would be convinced. That was why he had lured my son to Germany. That was why they had tricked him into agreeing to confess he was an impostor. A young, inexperienced boy could easily be imposed upon, and the public would certainly believe him if he should come forward and deny his own words. Another thing, too, might have motivated Adolf. This was his hatred for the brother who had caused him annoyance and embarrassment with his bigamous marriage, and who had been so reluctant to assist him when he had been in trouble in Liverpool. Perhaps he had welcomed his chance to humiliate him. Oh, the fuck is wrong with this guy? There we go. There, now you're gone, you son of a bitch. Fuck, type 73 messages of pap. Don't you ever do it again. I came to the conclusion that if it was inconvenient for Adolf Hitler to have an English relative at large, it was just as inconvenient for that English boy to have an uncle like Adolf. Besides, it might one day become a fatal circumstance to have him for an uncle, particularly as he might not always be allowed to carry on his activities unmolested. At least, that's how things looked to me that day. It would be best for Pat to sever everything that bound him to a man of that sort. Yes, Pat, I told my son, it's not about Adolf. Your father's sister Angela and your father say the same thing. There's nothing left for you to do but accept the situation and act accordingly. And I would advise you to tell the newspaper men who want to write about you that your relationship with Adolf is a mistake. I would even go a step further and advise you to change your name. Surely an English court would permit you to rid yourself of a name that is a handicap to you. They would really readily understand that you don't enjoy being called Hitler. When Pat didn't answer at once, I studied his face for a long time. What was going on in his mind? How was he taking this disillusionment and chagrin? What effect would it have on him? The most talked of man in the world was now forcing my son to demean himself before his own countrymen, to deny what he had honestly asserted, and the way he had been cajoled and bullied into making his promise. How must he feel about that? When I questioned him gently, his reply was serious and considered. Don't worry, mother. My whole opinion of my uncle has changed anyway. Since I saw him as he is, I don't want him for an uncle. In fact, I don't want to have anything to do with him, particularly as Geely died under such peculiar circumstances. This was the first time I knew that Geely, about whom Pat had so often spoken, was dead. But when? How? I never heard anything about it. Nor I. Perhaps I never would have heard anything about it, except by accident. When we were leaving Adolf's office, Aunt Angela shook her head and said, Poor Adolf, he is suffering terribly. He wouldn't have taken this so badly if he wasn't so unhappy about Geely's death. Naturally, my reaction was the same as yours just now. All Aunt Angela said was that Geely had died very suddenly 3 months before. On 18 September, Geely was dead. I couldn't believe it at first. A young, healthy girl, my own age. An accident, my father explained as we were waiting for the elevator. You mean a suicide? Angela corrected him sharply, curious that one should say one thing and the other another. I felt there was some mystery about it. I had no opportunity to question my father on the subject, but later in the afternoon, when I was alone with Mamie, I got her to tell me all she knew. Mamie, so quiet when Eloise was around, was always ready to talk in his absence. From the beginning of their acquaintanceship, Pat had found her a willing dispenser of intimate details on all topics relating to the family. This occasion was no exception, in spite of the fact that she had been sincerely fond of Geely, who was, from all I heard, an exceptionally warm-hearted and lovable girl. Mamie allowed her desire to gossip full play and reported all she knew and had heard about the affair, which included not only what Alois and Angela had told her, but also certain details she had obtained through conversations with the housekeeper. Angela, Adolphs, and Geely, Mamie told Pat, were having dinner in the Prinz Regent I can't say it apartment in Munich on 17 September. As they were eating, Geely said calmly, I should like to go to Vienna, Uncle Elf. Adolf had looked at her quickly. Why should you go to Vienna? What do they have there you don't have here? He was beginning their many times repeated discussion, which always ended in tears for Geely. But Geely, though her voice was trembling, quietly insisted, Dear Uncle Alf, I must go to Vienna for a little while. Realizing Geely wasn't going to be talked down, Adolf's attitude changed to one of hurt resentment. But why? Why do you want to go? I want to see Aunt Paula. Adolf pushed aside his plate and sat staring at the tablecloth. Minutes crawled by, but the silence continued. Finally, Adolf stood up and began shouting, We're getting to the bottom of this right now. You say you have to go to Vienna. Is it to see that filthy Jew, the one who claims to be a singing teacher? Is that it? Have you been seeing him secretly again? Have you forgotten I forbade you to have anything to do with him? Tell me the truth now. Why do you want to go to Vienna? And there's Geely. Informed pictures on the left show the close relationship between Adolf and his niece Geely. That's her. Not very good looking. He had a bad taste in women. Look at that fop. Above is the apartment block in the Prinz Regentenstrasse, where Geely died. Her mother, Angela Wright, is portrayed in Bridget's memoirs as the solemn supporter of the suicide story. Geely looked up into the tortured face of the man who was in love with her. I have to go to Vienna, Uncle Alf, because I'm going to have a baby. Completely stunned, Adolf had stared fixedly at his niece. It was some time before he spoke, in a voice like a two-edged knife, cutting himself even as he hurt her. That's just fine, wonderful. Perhaps I should congratulate you. Geely began to sob. The unexpected storm burst over her head, issuing in a torrent of questions. Is that scoundrel of a Jew? It's that scoundrel of a Jew. How could you do this to me? How long has this been going on? Why wasn't I told before? Geely could not answer, only sat weeping as Adolf flung the questions at her all over again. He gripped her shoulders and squeezed them as though to force a response from her. Still she remained mute. Suddenly, Adolf picked up his riding whip, which happened to be lying on a chair, with his hat, and went menacingly towards Geely. Aunt Angela screamed and took the whip from him, and then led him to a chair, in which he sank, completely unnerved. Staring now at Geely, now in front of him, he repeatedly shook his head. as though unable to comprehend. After a long time, he got to his feet and went to Gili, who hadn't uttered a word since her confession. Adolf gently placed his arm around her shoulder and said in a low, tortured voice, "Please don't worry. We'll find some way out. I'm terribly nervous, but I'll be all right soon. Then we can decide what to do." Angela, relieved that the storm was over, knowing that Adolf was leaving on a tour starting from Hamburg, proposed that the whole question be settled on Adolf's return. To this, Adolf agreed and went to his room to get ready for the trip, which was scheduled to last for about a week. Angela thought should return to Berchtesgaden, Berchtesgaden, where she was in charge, and asked Gili to go with her that night. But Gili insisted on remaining in Munich. Angela left at about 5 in the evening and subsequently was not in the apartment when the tragedy occurred. The story of what happened during the next hour was told later to Angela and Mamie by the housekeeper, Josephine Bauer, the only witness. For a while after Angela left, there was quiet, and then the shouting began again. Why or how, no one will ever know. Fragments of sentences, the words father, scandal, and then I can shoot myself, repeated several times, were all that penetrated to the ears of the anxious woman who was washing the dishes after that unfinished meal. Suddenly, there were running steps and the slam of a door. Furniture was falling, and she was sure Adolf was beating Gili. She claimed to have heard the swish of a whip, and Gili began to scream. Josephine Bauer screamed, too, in sympathy. A short time later, Adolf was about to leave for Hamburg and was already sitting in his car when Gili called down to him from her window. "Uncle Alf, I ask you once more, will you let me go to Vienna?" "No!" Adolf shouted back from the street. Then there was the muffled roar of the Mercedes starting, and he was gone. Perhaps a quarter of an hour later, Josephine Bauer entered the living room. As it was empty, she continued on through the other rooms until she came to Gili's. It was locked. Fraulein Gili, she called. Gili did not immediately answer. Then, in a voice scarcely audible, through the door she replied, "He's locked me in." Josephine Bauer went to the kitchen for a bunch of keys, one of which fitted Gili, lying on the bed, smiled briefly and murmured, "Thanks," but refused any further assistance except to ask for a small box in which to bury the body of Hans, one of the 4 canaries given her by Adolf, which had died that day. Next morning, when Josephine Bauer arrived at 7, as usual, the apartment was full of men. Windows were closed and blinds drawn. Josephine Bauer was informed that Gili was dying and that she was to remain in the kitchen and keep quiet. The terrified woman could get no one to pay attention to her. Shortly after 7, Josephine Bauer telephoned Angela in Berchtesgaden, telling her that Gili was sick. Something terrible had happened. It was 10 in the morning when Angela arrived. The room was full of Adolf's friends. They told Angela that Adolf had received the news in the night and had returned shortly before Angela. He and Dr. Brandt, an intimate friend, were with Gili. As soon as Angela realized what had happened, she rushed towards Gili's room but was not allowed to enter. Beating on the door with her fists, she demanded to see her daughter, but was kept outside. Although Gili lived for some hours more, only Adolf and Dr. Brandt remained with the dying girl. Suddenly the door opened. Adolf stood in the doorway, eyes bloodshot, face waxy pale, hair hanging in a matted tangle. Seeing his sister, he abruptly retreated towards Hermann Göring, who stood a short distance away, and collapsing again, against the latter's shoulders, began to weep hysterically, saying, "She's dead, she's dead." Angela, who had automatically started towards her daughter's room when she saw Adolf come out, stood before him as though powerless to take another step. "She's dead," Adolf cried, "and I am her murderer. And I am her murderer." I can't say it. At those words, Goring intervened. "You're upset, Adolf. You mustn't say a thing like that. Frau Robel might misunderstand. Tell her the truth that Geely committed suicide." He turned to Angela. "My Fuhrer was not even here." Goring's emphasis on the fact that Adolf was not present when Geely was shot became the keynote of Adolf's alibi. He wasn't there when it happened, according to the account Angela publicly gave of the fatal evening. Adolf left for Munich and then Geely committed suicide. But people whispered that Adolf had come back. Mamie hinted to Pat. In fact, added Mamie, Angela once let slip something to the effect, but quickly reverted to the official story. Nobody knows, Mamie concluded, what really happened except that Geely was shot. This was the gist of the story, Mamie told Pat. When she had finished, he wanted to ask her some questions, but Mamie must have regretted having carried on to tell him so much, for she nervously asked him not to speak of it anymore. "I don't know what happened that night," Pat said to me in a troubled voice, "and I didn't have time to find out. But from what Mamie told me, I don't see how it could have been a suicide. Adolf's departure and immediate return sounds wrong to me somehow, and if he came back that night, he must have found Geely alone in the Prinzregentenstrasse flat, because Aunt Angela was in Berchtesgaden. God knows what might have happened between them. Poor Geely. Well, it's not my business, I suppose. She wasn't even my cousin. Anyway, my relationship with Adolf is finished, closed. I'd like to forget the whole thing." And here is Angela with her brother Adolf Hitler. Is that the end? That is the end of that section. All right, Brobs. That's all. That's all. What was that, 35 minutes? Not too bad.